The Apostle Paul was in prison when he wrote a letter to Christians at Philippi in Macedonia. The letter from prison is a long tradition that reaches from Paul to such 20th century figures as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King Jr. Such letters are extraordinary documents of personal history, addressed to families in resistance, to religious communities in encouragement, and to their fellow prisoners in solidarity. But prisoners frequently transform these personal messages into highly charged public testimonies. Smuggled from behind prison walls, letters were copied, printed, circulated as assertions to the public of religious faith and political protest. Published prison letters transformed the conventions of personal correspondence into acts of bearing witness. Persons who believe themselves to be unjustly incarcerated for their fidelity to conscience. 500 years ago, King Henry VIII of England provoked an extraordinary outpouring of letters from prison as successive generations of conscientious protesters refused to be incorporated within the changing boundaries of royal government and the officially established church. Sir Thomas More wrote letters from prison to his daughter Margaret Roper in 1534 and 1535, and they were followed in the next century and a half by hundreds of prison letters from both eminent and socially obscure men and women. Protestants during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor, Catholic priests during the reign of Elizabeth, Democratic pamphleteers, religious visionaries, Quaker women, Baptists. By the end of the 17th century, nearly 2,000 letters from prison had been circulated as acts of political resistance. Letters from prison challenged the recipients of the letter, both the original readers 500 years ago and us, persons who decades or even centuries later also read the prison letter and are challenged to hear and respond to its message. The prisoner of conscience faces the daunting political problem of making a persuasive case that incarceration results from acts of ethical principle and are not irresponsible acts of public disruption. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail 62 years ago in April 1963. He said, "My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined, legal, and nonviolent resistance. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Nonviolent direct action seeks to establish such creative tension that a privileged community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." 500 years earlier, John Frith, who long ago was burned for heresy during the reign of King Henry VIII, wrote from Newgate Prison in the weeks before his execution, "Why should one side have all the words and the other be put to silence. Two letters, written in 1554 and 1555, will illustrate across the centuries the continuing ethical impact of the prisoner of conscience who, in Frith's words, refuses to be put to silence. First, a letter to family members. Early in 1554, the Catholic Queen of England, Mary Tudor, imprisoned John Bradford, a theologian at Cambridge University. Bradford wrote from the Tower of London to his mother, emphasizing that as soon as his family had finished reading his letter, it must be burned. The letter's discovery, Bradford warned, would reveal that he had pen and ink, and this evidence might cast him into some dungeon in fetters of iron. Despite this warning, Bradford rejoiced that this God was merciful and had permitted Bradford to be imprisoned not for Bradford's vices, but for God's gospel's sake, for his church's sake. Bradford was therefore merry and glad that God had chosen him as a witness, and he assured that his mother that he would rejoice even more if I could get you to be merry with me. To evoke that shared joy, Bradford's letter included a prayer that he instructed his brother Roger, to make a copy of this prayer before the letter as a whole was destroyed. Good mother, he says, mark what I have written and learn this prayer by heart. To say it daily, and then I shall be merry and you shall rejoice. As he composed the prayer, Bradford and his mother would recite together. Bradford identified them with the Old Testament prophet Samuel and his mother Hannah, who had dedicated Samuel before his birth to the service of God. The emphasis fell on a life of unswerving fidelity, especially in this crucial sentence of the prayer. As Hannah did apply and give her first child Samuel unto thee, so do I, dear Father, beseeching thee for Christ's sake to accept this my gift and give my son, John Bradford, grace always truly to serve thee and thy people as Samuel did. Bradford's letter illustrates two critical dimensions of these prison dialogues, addressing his family and exploring the family as a metaphor of human solidarity. First, the letter spoke from personal knowledge of very specific events, providing a vivid challenge to this family's solidarity. This story of family intimacy created a personal dialogue in which prisoner and reader shared their emotions of self-discovery, rejoicing together. Second, even after the letter was burned, and John Bradford was burned, the letter remained. The identification between the body of John Bradford and his printed letter, both burned at the stake, yet surviving in memory and in print, invited later readers to add further layers of interpretation to this communication between son and mother. John Bradford is incorporated with Samuel and Hannah into a meta-narrative that confronts the reader with a human story when a crucial decision must be made, even though the outcome of that decision remains uncertain. To repeat a phrase from Martin Luther King's prison letter, now is the time. Now is the time of decision. At the moment of writing, the prison letter's consequences are unknown. Yet reading the letter, I am confronted with an inescapable ethical decision. The idea of an epistolary community extends beyond family loyalty. The letter from prison addresses a multiplicity of communities, especially religious communities and the national society. This multiplicity generates the ethical resistance that is a hallmark of the letter from prison, a crisis of allegiances. In a common dramatic metaphor, the prison writer imaginatively places the reader of that letter in a courtroom, expecting the reader of the prison letter as a juror to render a judgment. A second letter from one prisoner to a group of his fellow prisoners. Prison testimony thus addresses tensions among the disciplinary power of the state, a resistant community's discipline, and personal spiritual disciplines. These tensions appeared in a letter written from John Hooper, the imprisoned former Bishop of Worcester, written in early January 1555. Hooper received a report that an underground congregation had gathered at a home where constables arrested and jailed about 30 persons from that congregation. The congregants humbly obeyed the arresting officers, since they had not gathered to conspire or make any tumult, but only, like Christians, Christianly to pray. Hooper wrote a letter of support to the prisoners, offering specific advice, both to prepare them for examination by the authorities and to bolster their courage against intimidation. Persevere in your testimony before the authorities, because God will be present in your hearts and in your mouths to speak his wisdom. Hooper's letter incorporated a miniature sermon inside his letter, which identified the prisoners as spiritual soldiers enlisted for steadfast ethical principles. Now ye be even in the field and placed in the forefront of Christ's battle. Also you have standing at your backs all the multitude of the faithful who take courage, strength, and desire to follow such noble and valiant Christians as ye be. Parallel to a family's disciplined steadfastness, Hooper's letter engaged loyal, metaphorical soldiers in a dialogue not simply with God, but also with their consciences and their wider religious community, bearing responsible witness, standing at the forefront of nonviolent battle. And a surprising, to me, shift of metaphors. Hooper's epistolary sermon drew its second key illustration from the Christmas season. He turned away from spiritual warfare to focus on images of domestic intimacy and imprisonment's disruption of daily household life. Hooper depicted the angelic announcement of Christ's birth to shepherds in a field, who immediately left their flocks and journeyed to Bethlehem. They did not pause, Hooper emphasized, to debate among themselves who should keep the wolf from the sheep in the meantime, but did as they were commanded and committed their sheep unto him whose pleasure they obeyed. This, wrote Hooper to his fellow prisoners, was now these prisoners' circumstance. They must decide whether to bear witness to one who has called them. At this decisive moment of faithful testimony, God would maintain the households. God will help the husband. He will comfort his wife. He will guide the servants. He will keep the house. He will preserve the goods. Yea, rather than it should be undone, he will wash the dishes and rock the cradle. Cast therefore all your care upon God, for he careth for you. Imprisonment for their shared commitment to a common cause had served to identify Hooper with his fellow prisoners. Hooper's letter portrayed a chasm between a forceful state and a peaceful community. The outcome of this conflict remained unresolved, and it depended on the faithfulness of the prisoners. Metaphorical battles and pilgrimages envisioned completion in a future victory or the destination of a journey. But this imagined completion stood in tension with the basic nature of the letter from prison. A letter's incompleteness was a single statement from an ongoing written dialogue, and its contingency was a decision rendered when no outcome was certain and in view. Bearing witness from prison, the letter's incompleteness and contingency heightened the drama, even the necessity of decision. But what does Hooper's portrayal of Christmas shepherds contribute to this letter's narrative form? The shepherds abruptly left their flocks and departed for Bethlehem. John Hooper and the prisoners are joining in the spirit by fidelity to a cause and face the decision to leave behind all manner of household responsibilities, from washing dishes to rocking the cradle. These narratives of departure are striking, since, as the letter of John Bradford to his mother, with which I began, prison letters typically underscored the fidelity, the loyalty of the writer to family, friends, and religious communities. Yet, scenes of departure from all earthly obligations out of responsibility to a transcending ethical obligation are also an indispensable feature of the letter from prison. When prison writers combine scriptural images of departure with exhortations that their readers lay aside all the cares and responsibilities of the world, they became what Hélène Cixous called writers of extremity, who take themselves and their readers to the extremes of experience. Their literary texts break, she writes, with our thought habits, with the world around us, and hurl us off into foreign countries. Such texts press readers to think about the uncertain consequences of decisions beyond the present moment in which the letter was being written. The most difficult thing for human beings to do is to think ahead, wrote Cixous, to put ourselves in the shoes of those we have not yet been. Hooper's rhetorical collision between family responsibilities and biblical shepherds creates an imaginative space in which the scene of abrupt departure provokes the reader to put ourselves in the shoes of those we have not yet been. Both prisoners and their readers imaginatively confront an impending decision with consequences that cannot be fully anticipated. Yet, those who trust that the cradle will nonetheless be rocked may encounter the truth about life's fulfillment, comparable to the ancient shepherds who dared to leave their sheep and journey to Bethlehem. The prisoner turned from the cares of this world and focused on an ultimate goal. Hooper's evocation of the shepherds and their abrupt departure to Bethlehem vividly depicted an additional dimension of the prisoner's own personal obligation. That prison writer's transformative sense of wonder at seeing a new dimension of the world, a future that put ourselves in the shoes of those we have not yet been. With confidence in that uncertain future, Martin Luther King affirmed that those who have gone together to jail have gone in the faith that right defeated, that might defeated is strong, that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Have gone in faith to jail, that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Thank you.